Hello, everybody. It's Lorcan Brennan here from the Men's Development Network, and I have with me today two colleagues who are part of the marking and celebration of International Men's Health Week for 2026. I've asked them to look in at me to talk about something that I find, and you will find probably as well, very interesting. A project called the State of the World Fathers going across Europe and the world for a number of years. And both Dr. Kenny Doyle and Dr. Jordan Kirwan are involved in it from the organisation's point of view, and indeed brought out research a couple of years ago that maybe they'll reference as well when we get going in relation to the State of World Fathers. So guys, you're very, very welcome, and thanks for giving me this time just to mark it, especially International Men's Week, and we're coming up to Father's Day in the week as well on the Sunday. So Kenny, can I begin by just asking, you know, for people looking in today and they might see what we're about and they've seen the State of World Fathers, they don't know much about it. A brief synopsis, what be it, and tell us a little bit about it. Where did it start?
Okay, thanks, Lorcan, and it's lovely to be talking to you this morning. The State of World's Fathers is a study that was set up by a think tank based in Washington called Equimundo. And the aim of it is basically to research attitudes globally to care, to paternity, to gender roles within families, and to try and get kind of a snapshot every 3 or 4 years about kind of the state of play in across a number of countries globally. Ireland did its first contribution to it in 2023 with this report here. That is not shown, but if you Google it, you'll see it. And the last time we did it, I think it was about 17 countries globally. So you're looking at countries in Europe, countries in the US, Canada, Mexico, countries in South America, a handful of African countries, a handful of Asian countries. I think Australia was in that one too. And so it does give a very broad picture, globally speaking, in terms of kind of the state of play around kind of gender relations within the home, and who cares and who does what and under what circumstances. The basic kind of assumption underlining it is that if men are to do more in terms of care work within the home, whether that's with their own children or with their own parents or even with their partners and so on, and in their communities, then that will free up what is a lot of work that's currently being done mostly unpaid by women. And it's actually a massive step towards kind of broader gender equality. It would fix a lot of problems, or go towards fixing problems such as the glass ceiling, where women will generally not be promoted beyond a certain level in their careers because they have caring responsibilities, and at some point they'll kick in. When they have children, maybe there'll be a stage where they need to kind of take a step back from their career progression because they have care responsibilities at home. They might work part-time, and this is stuff that happens all over the world, not just in Ireland. This time around, the study was actually much bigger. All of them so far, and there is like a wealth of resources in this area now, because it's been running for, I think it's about 12 years altogether across different countries. So if you Google State of the World's Fathers reports, you can see localized and regional reports from places like Ireland, the UK, Scandinavia, the US, China, but you can also see the international reports that are done that give that global snapshot. This time around, as well as doing a survey, we also did a series of interviews globally. And this is really important because surveys are really good at picking up trends, and they're really good at picking up whether something is happening, or the extent to which something is or isn't happening. But when you actually can go out and talk to people and have open conversations with them, what you get in those kind of circumstances is explanations as to why, in terms of people's real life lived experience, as to why certain things are happening, or why they think the way they do, or why they don't behave in certain ways, and so on. So that's a really, really rich resource again this time, and we'll have a global set of interview data that was drawn on for the international report. And then another thing we did this year as part of the interviews is the Photo Voice project, where we wrote prompts to give to everybody who was interviewed. And the prompts are along the lines of if you can take a picture of something that symbolizes the joys of caring. And then the other one was to symbolize something you find difficult or hard about the care work that you do. And that was a really eye-opening experience altogether, because if you talk to someone and you ask them a direct question, they'll kind of say what's in the top of their head, and you can kind of, if you're a skilled interviewer like the one we had doing our interviews, you can kind of get to the bottom of what people really think and what they mean when they say the things they say. But if you give someone, it's almost like giving someone a bit of homework where they have to go away and think about it, and they have to come up with something that's kind of symbolic and represents something, and then they have to write their thoughts down about why it is. And it was really, really revealing. Like in the Irish context, a really beautiful pair of pictures we had was a lady took a picture of her garden, and she had written a lovely piece about the work she put into her garden, and she had pictures of the flowers and vegetables all in a lovely row. And then so that was the positive bit of how much she enjoyed and the care and the love that she puts into caring for her children. But then the other part, which was about the struggles around caring, she had a picture of some insect bites on some of the plants and some I suppose weeds and things like that were popping in. And the lovely bit piece she had written about was that there's at some stage, as with the garden, as with caring, there's some stage that you kind of have to say my work is done and hope that the garden can fend for itself and that it will flourish. There's this lovely metaphor between working on our garden and raising children, and there was lots of really, really nice stuff like that. There was another really gorgeous photo that the joy of caring was just 3 pairs of shoes that were lined up in front of a front door, and you can tell that they've kind of been through the mud, and they have the signs of people out playing and enjoying the world. And that person, I think, for the negative bit, was kind of talking about the social media and the online world, and drew these lovely distinctions between the real world that we all inhabit with our children, that is play and mud and football and all those great things, versus this kind of Wild West, which is the online world that they can't really control. So the study this time around is just way bigger. There's a lot more kind of color and shade in the data that we have. It's not just numbers. And myself and Jordan, I'd say we'll be kind of playing around with the data we have for a couple of years at this rate, and releasing reports on an ongoing basis, because it really is a goldmine that kind of gives us a snapshot of what's going on at the moment.
Well done. It's a fabulous initiative, and you've given us some insights into some of the stuff we'll go back and chat about in a few moments as well. And Jordan, just I suppose what Kenny is saying, it's all framed in the international conversation that's around the changing nature of masculinities. And you've been reading through it. I know we were talking earlier as well, and you were saying, some of the key findings, it is in process. It's not finished yet. What are some of the things that you've been finding? Kenny has mentioned a few of the things that are in there as the expressions of it, but some of the key findings that are there in relation to masculinities and caring and fatherhood, what stays with you when you look through it?
I suppose, as Kenny mentioned, there's been a few iterations of this type of project. What you probably find is some of the findings kind of stay the same. There's kind of like different kind of trends that might happen every so often. There might be a small kind of deviation away from it. But more often than not, it's kind of like these kind of persistent and incremental changes that happen within the kind of broader ideas that happen within kind of different contexts based, say, on the time that they happen within. And even within this one, you kind of see that men still continue to place fairly strong values behind being the providers in families, or being the kind of the protector of their family, or whatever it might be. But what we're seeing a lot of in this project, or in this data, there is a kind of growing expectation, I suppose, within the kind of participants, that men should also have this kind of emotional presence within their caregiving. It's not necessarily just about kind of financial provision anymore. And instead of, I suppose, in coming away from that, maybe that typical kind of breadwinner model that we might have seen for years, there is more of a kind of a push now for men to be more actively involved in their family life. And that comes from both the men and women themselves. That's not just kind of women saying it, or just the men saying it. It's both sides of the fence, essentially. So you're kind of looking at that, I suppose, that those values are kind of they kind of exist beside one another now. And what we're kind of finding now, which is quite interesting, is that tends to be held quite strongly by kind of younger age groups in particular, where they seem to hold on to those kind of traditional views a hell of a lot more than they do the older generations. But I suppose as time goes on, you can kind of see the generations or the age groups that are within the study kind of tend to soften on those kind of traditional values a little bit more.
Yes.
So we're kind of seeing this now where there's this there's this kind of coming together of a different set of values and expectations around caregiving. But I suppose the big thing to take away from it is that, you know, even though those kind of traditional and maybe new ideas around what masculinities are and what caregiving are and everything else, is that, you know, across the sample, caregiving is spoken about, and family life as well is spoken about as the utmost important thing in people's lives, you know, bar none, essentially. I think there's something to kind of look at there, I think, post-pandemic maybe, where I suppose a lot of people's priorities switched and people were spending a lot more time at home. They were probably spending more time with their family. And it probably, even though family life was always important and care was always important to people, it's always been a cornerstone in terms of our own existence as people. But it's just far more pronounced now. And you're kind of seeing that a lot now within this kind of data set, that this is as I said, the utmost important thing in people's lives. And people just want the time and the ability to be able to do it. So as I mentioned at the start, a lot of these things don't necessarily really happen kind of in a vacuum. They're very sensitive to the time and the place and the context of the world around us. So what we're kind of seeing in this is that although care and family life is the most important thing and people want to be doing that more than anything else, it's set in the backdrop of essentially a financial crisis. There's a cost of living crisis, and people are basically finding that this is one of the biggest hindrances to be able to do that properly. So there's a huge, if you looked at the findings at the start before any sort of real analysis was done, if you scroll through the survey findings really, really quickly, there's a lot of doom and gloom throughout it. You know, if you were to look at it at a very first glance, there's a fair few people within your context particularly struggling to make those, to kind of live their life the way they want to within the kind of family context and the caring context because of the financial and the economic and the political context that happens around it. So I suppose what you get with that is the kind of the conflict then that might happen with care, who does what, and so on and so on. So I suppose in terms of masculinity and what it means for men, it does kind of reflect that kind of uncertainty around the social context we're in, who does what, whose role is what. And I suppose that's why you get that little bit of a crossover, that little bit of tension that we might come to later between the traditional and the kind of, maybe if you want to call it the new age, or the kind of the more, the kind of new kind of take on what we think masculinities ought to be.
Okay, that's really interesting. Kenny, time, culture, space we're in, as Jordan has just said there, and its influence and impact, especially on all people in the world, but we're looking at masculinities today. You've been reading research and doing research for a while now. Are you surprised to see that, first of all, as it already been said by Jordan, that there's this openness, this family value, caring value, men and even younger men wanting to be more engaged and involved in? Is that new for you in findings in relation to research? Is it a good finding? Is it good to see that in there in the midst of the other challenges that Jordan's talking about?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, the last time we ran this survey, and it probably is, as Jordan referred to, a function of the fact that we're so close to COVID and lockdowns and people working from home all the time and so on. But that's found overwhelmingly that men wanted to do more in terms of time with their families. They wanted to do more in terms of care and work in the community. And it was kind of like, well, maybe career isn't absolutely everything. And we have seen a slight change in some ways away from that. And like I'm never surprised at a finding that says men want to spend more time with their children, or they want to spend more time with their family because of course they do. But some of the things we found this time around that were a little bit surprising, I have to say. And again, we're talking about how kind of the broader social, cultural, and particularly economic realities shape ideas and attitudes at a given time. And one of the things we're seeing that I'm quite surprised by is that a lot of younger men have what would be classed as very traditionalist views of masculinity, and particularly very traditionalist views around kind of the role of a man in the household. I have some statistics here from this iteration of the survey, where if we look at the age group of men aged 18 to 25, 56% of them agreed or strongly agreed with this statement that full-time fathers are not real men. 70% of them agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that a father's sole responsibility is to provide financially for his children. And less than 20% of men aged 18 to 25 thought it was important for a woman to provide financially for her family. Of that same group, 50% of them said that carrying out domestic and care work was the most important thing a mother could do. And it's one of the things that when you look, Jordan did some fantastic work mapping these kind of attitudes across different age ranges. And it really, really falls off a cliff the older people get. And we've been kind of talking between us about what this means and trying to explain it, because you can look at statistics that'll tell you something, but then you have to try and think about, well, why are people saying this? Is it the case that older people are a little bit more lived in? They're more likely to be in long-term relationships. They're more likely to have actually hands-on experience of managing and balancing care responsibilities. And so they kind of have been in the trenches and realize it. Or is it that younger men are kind of being, I suppose, exposed to kind of malign influences on the internet and the manosphere and all of that stuff? And there's no real definitive way we'll be able to say it, but it is kind of, I found very interesting that interviews that attitudes that about 10 years ago would have seen as being kind of backward and almost Stone Age are really resurgent among young men.
Okay, and Kenny, are either of you, you mentioned manosphere, and you've mentioned time and space and where people spend their time, and probably, as I say, not just probably, but a lot of young men do hang out in the online world. So is some of it must be to do with that space, that place, and if so, if you were speaking to me as a policymaker or as a program developer or an initiative developer, is there anything even at the beginning that we're starting to see, well, if this is something we could be doing to maybe have a conversation into that space? What's your thoughts on that? Or maybe that's an unfair question when the research is so early.
Yeah, well, it's we're not the only study to find this, first of all. We both do work on advisory groups and stuff for other research that's going on, and we both would kind of keep up with stuff produced by the different organizations around the country, and it has become a kind of common thread. It's not completely new that young people think this way. Like over the last 5 or 6 years, this is becoming quite common. Finian Murphy did a great piece for Women's Aid about the man box a couple of years ago that really drew these attitudes out. But this kind of thing about being more likely to endorse restrictive norms of masculinity than they would have been in the past. It is particularly around gender roles in relationships, and it's particularly around the idea that the man needs to be the provider. And like the central role of the father in this idea is to provide financially. And that is a bit at odds with stuff we found in the past and stuff we also found within this study about men wanting to be more involved. So there's this kind of almost a dualism where men and even young men will talk about how important it is to have a family and keep the home fires burning and to be an active participant in raising children, but they also value financial provision as the top thing, and that's their main responsibility. It does beg the obvious question of why this has happened. It's hard, if not impossible, to establish a definitive causal link between factors, but it is very hard to dismiss the fact that online influencers and the wider cultural context have recently kind of acted to bring what would often be misogynistic views further into the mainstream. And if not misogynistic views, then at least kind of ideas about the role of men in the family that would be far more traditional than they would have been in the most recent past, I suppose.
Okay, and maybe either of you as well, or maybe Jordan might come in on this. Conscious of time for us as well, folks. It's only an introduction to the state of world fathers, and people can read more about it, and we'll send you to where you can go for that. But just what I was saying earlier, Jordan, as well, in the context then of the conversation we need to be having into the sphere, we often talk in the men's development network about, becoming your most authentic self or developing our emotional and expressive intelligence. Is there ways we can do more of that? And we talk about safer spaces where perhaps as younger men as well, we can explore or unpack some of those ideas we have around what we feel it is to be the expression of masculinity, and maybe it might become more willow than oak. I don't know I'm just asking, what are your thoughts on that reading through the materials?
I suppose there's an argument there that it's probably already happening in a lot of cases. Like it's the data is in such a way where you can't necessarily just sit, like, a lot of the younger people and young men are holding on to kind of more traditional views, but they also have kind of more what we would probably consider to be progressive views alongside of it as well. They're not necessarily like completely like into one extreme over the other, so there's an argument to be said that, as I said, they're happening at the same time. There's normally, when they do research like this, Kenny had mentioned there around kind of certain global studies that keep finding the same thing that we've just found. There was a study done recently by the Ombudsman for Children that made a note, I suppose, within it, that typically within any study that looks into kind of young men's attitudes within this kind of context, not necessarily caring, but anything that tests for like kind of traditional or extremist views or whatever it might be, is that they find anywhere between a third and a fifth of any young men that participate in the study typically hold these things. But what you're finding then within it is that it is a third and a fifth, but there is still a majority that are holding on to kind of values that are maybe less harmful to others and things like that as well. But I suppose it's also important to kind of qualify within it that traditional and conservative isn't necessarily always bad. Like some of these kind of traditional values are, linked to qualities like resilience or like a sense of responsibility or self-sufficiency or whatever it might be. They're not necessarily bad things in isolation. These values aren't, if you were to do a job interview in the morning and someone asked you what your strengths were, these are probably some of the things that you might list about yourself, so they're not necessarily bad things to say. As I mentioned there, I kind of hinted on earlier, it's only when those values become harmful to others that you have to kind of look at them a little bit, or that they're harmful to the men themselves that have them. So I suppose the educational aspect of it is that, it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's not about trying to bring about a newly minted version of masculinity that we all think is great, that might necessarily suit the others in society. It's about leaving them happen side by side and in line with one another, and just ensuring that those types of qualities and values that you have are the ones that you hold important to yourself as a man, or even as a young man or whatever it might be, don't come back to bite you, I suppose, in the end. Because what we've found, even outside of the State of World's Fathers, with our work with MDN over the years, is that those types of qualities and values that you might have, they're the types of ones that might make it more likely for you not to look for help when you need it the most, and that's where the education aspect would want to pick up. But I wouldn't have said any study, it's an interesting trend, but I don't think any study the world over, like, it's always a snapshot of what it is, it's always a snapshot of the population or a trend that we might see, but there is risks, I suppose, involved in panicking maybe about how to solve this, or this is there is room, I suppose, to leave these things happen, I suppose, side by side with one another, and looking at how this can be built into versions of masculinities that we are already used to and what people are already used to, as opposed to ripping things up and trying to start again. I think that's really the way forward with these types of things, when you see trends like that across different studies and stuff the world over, particularly in this one.
Okay, a fascinating study, and we will say more about it on the link when where people can go for it. Kenny, you had a final word just on it. It's ongoing. For yourself, to go back to where we started from, I'm just wondering, what are the surprising things that you're finding in it yourself? You feel as saying, well, going away from this study, Jordan has mentioned some of them, I think, and really framed it very well. That stays with you to say, well, there's really good learning for us here in relation to where we can reply and respond.
There's it's kind of hard. Like the last time we brought out one report. This time when we were kind of looking at the data we had thematically, we were kind of saying if we put this out at one report, it's going to be 70 to 100 odd pages. So instead of doing that and having something no one will read, we'll bring out maybe 3 or 4 different ones and arrange them in thematically that way. I think the interviews this time around really it's a more expensive way of doing work, and it takes a lot more time and effort, but it is really worth it. There's a lot of stuff you get from sitting down talking to somebody, or indeed asking them to take a photograph and describe it, that you don't get no matter how well you organize a survey. Like, for example, one of the questions we put into the interviews was to ask people to think about, this is when we were talking to parents, to ask them to think about their own childhood and compare it to their children's childhood. And there was really some magical stuff that came out of that. And a lot of the stuff that came out of that was very similar. A lot of it was based around the idea that people my age and older, perhaps a little bit younger, were kind of a lot more free range in childhood than children are these days. That children these days are supervised in one way or another almost around the clock. They're not just let out to wander off like I was as a child. And that says a lot kind of about social trust and social bonds, and kind of ideas and conceptions around public safety that when I was a child wandering around the street, if there was something wrong with me, everyone would assume that someone would come out and say, "Oh, are you okay?" and take me to my parents if needs be. I'm not sure that's quite the same, or I'm not sure people believe that's quite the same these days. So that's just like one bit. We were talking a bit as well about younger people, and I think when we're talking about young people, and because there is a lot of conversation around the manosphere and stuff like that now, it's really important to kind of underline the fact that experience teaches wisdom, and that, like I'd mentioned it a bit already about kind of attitudes to work in the home and stuff like that, that when people experience these things, they'll realize, oh, actually I might be wrong about this. And like, young people are never a completely finished project. None of us are. I can't remember the quote, but there's a memorable one from an author before who said, "Show me a complete person and I'll show you a complete idiot." And that's kind of in terms of kind of no one is a complete person, and it's something when we're writing and thinking about young people that we need to kind of keep at the forefront of our thoughts.
Well, look at folks, it's really good talking with you, and that is a good place to keep that in mind when we're talking about every person. We know that we are in process, we are on the way to somewhere for the good, we hope. Really looking forward to keeping an eye out for the thematic insights that you're going to bring along to us and bring along to the public sphere in relation to the research you're doing. It's really fascinating, and I hope you've whetted people's appetite to go and have a little bit of a look around there for some of those other findings that are in there. But thanks so much for being with us, and especially for International Men's Health Week. And we'll catch up with you again hopefully soon to talk more about this. So go well.
Lovely stuff. Thank you, Lorcan. Cheers.
Thank you.